Since changing the name of the Eclectic Americana Friday morning drive time radio show on January 20th, 1989 to the Bushwhackers Breakfast Club, the DJs in the collective have strived to entertain and inform our listeners. Airing from 6 to 9 a.m. Pacific at KZSC 88.1 FM in Santa Cruz, California, the Bushwhackers usually have 2 interviews a week, each airing for about half an hour. We're not afraid to ask questions or admit that we don't know something, and we don't mind taking deep dives or following a tangent as we get into how sausage is made in local, county, or state politics, or learning about things going on in our community, or discussions with artists. Our interviews are not scripted and are produced by myself, Dangerous Dan Orange.
Good morning, KZSC. You are on the air.
Good morning.
Good morning, California State Senator John Laird. How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing fine.
Oh, fantastic.
We're at a crazy time of the year. The governor releases his budget later this morning, and in 10 days is the deadline for all bills to get out of the first house, so things are kind of nutty.
Gotcha. How are you feeling about the budget that's going to come out later? Are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic? Do you feel like it's going to stick a wrench in any gears?
It's going to be horrible.
Oh.
I think it's just going to be horrible. He's going to finally have to be serious about how bad it is. And we did, I've lost track, 2 or 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, we did early actions. And so we closed the gap by about 15 or 17 billion, but then it gets to whatever he determines the remaining deficit is, which I think is going to be 20 to 25 billion, and there's just no easy things to do to close it. So I think we're going to finally see the worst of the worst.
Well, let's go from the billions and the entire state of California to our little town, and an op-ed that you put out in the Sentinel on Tuesday, April 30th, because there's a vote coming up at the City Council on Tuesday. Ben Rice was here with us in the studio live at 7 o'clock here this morning, and we spent 15 minutes talking about WAMM, the Women's Alliance for Medical Marijuana. And you, Senator Laird, weighed in on this, and so has Assemblymember Pellerin. Let's spend a couple of minutes talking about that and why you weighed in and your thoughts on it.
Well, first, the op-ed is really self-explanatory, and anybody that goes to it can see sort of the history of HIV in this community, and then WAMM, and then just why I believe what's happening right now isn't fair. But the thing is I felt like I had sort of a unique perspective. I lived through the HIV epidemic in Santa Cruz, which was, it's interesting because I think that's one of the reasons I weighed in. I think for a lot of people, they either weren't here, weren't alive, weren't an adults, don't have any frame of reference for what happened then. And because in Santa Cruz County, and you said our small county, I mean, compared to the urban areas we are, but in the 10 years starting 1985 to 1995, we lost 240 people in Santa Cruz County. That's HIV, and I think that's even misleading because there were a lot of people that spent their adult life here and went home to wherever they'd lived before they had been in Santa Cruz to live the last part of their life. And so it was a monumental impact. And what's hard for people to remember is just how awful it was. There was no drug cocktail. If you had an HIV diagnosis, that was probably it. And I used a couple of examples in the op-ed just to describe how awful it was in those times. I mean, one, I was on the city council 1981 to 1990. 6 of us started the Santa Cruz AIDS Project somewhere around 1985. And there was somebody fired from their job for volunteering with a person with HIV. There was such a stigma. People were afraid. They weren't sure how it was transmitted. And I, as a city council member, introduced an ordinance to have a non-discrimination law on the basis of HIV status so that somebody couldn't get fired like that. I had to do that when that happened. And at the time, almost everybody with HIV was low in assets, so they were on Medi-Cal, and no dentist in Santa Cruz County would take Medi-Cal for a person with HIV. For the AIDS Project, our dental program was a transportation voucher to San Francisco so that you could just get up there for medical care. And so there were very few people that stepped up. I mean, in the LGBT community, it was very interesting because I think until that time, there was this real split between men and women, and I think in particular many were misogynist. Many did not. It was this overall umbrella, but it was difficult, and I think that is the time that. And I said it for the oral history that the Museum of Art and History did. I said the women stepped up. They just stepped up. They volunteered. They took people in. They bought food. They did in-home care. And I think if there's a turning point in the history of the LGBT movement about how people work together, it was that time. And when I say a few organizations, the other one is Planned Parenthood was just totally there all the way through. And while I strongly support reproductive freedoms, there's an added emotion to it because they stood up when nobody else stood up. And that is what is true with WAMM. They, and this was right in their early days or when they started doing stuff in the early 1990s. And at the time, and Val Corral, who with her husband at the time, Michael Corral, she had an injury in a car accident, and the symptoms were really affected by using marijuana medicinally, and she grew. They grew it, and they were even arrested. It wasn't even legal for medicinal purposes at the time, but they really stepped up for people with HIV because the last weeks and months were horrific. I mean horrific. The symptoms, the illness, and the fact that they risked getting arrested, figured out how to fund it, and distributed cannabis to the people that were in need was just this incredible compassionate act. So when they really, the organization and Val put her life savings into this dispensary, and they played completely by the rules, and they spent tens of thousands of dollars as a partner with somebody else to do this, and they get the permit, and then there's an attempt to move the goalpost. You can't have under city ordinance a dispensary within 500 feet of the school. This is 800 feet. And there's an attempt to change it. It was appealed to the Planning Commission, which upheld the permit 5-2. But as you said, it's now going to the City Council next week. And as I said in the op-ed, the last thing I ever want to do is weigh in on a local zoning matter. I mean, I've got, this is a family radio show, so I don't want to use the word shit show but I'm in the middle of all these other controversies that are just off the charts that really divide people that are emotional. I need a local land use issue.
So, John,
I need a hole on my head.
Hang on, Senator Laird, because you did use one of those 7 words that the FCC says we can't use between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m., I have to read the following. So just hang on one second because I want to come back to this. Sure. As a non-commercial educational radio station, KZSE supports free expression of ideas. Please be aware that the opinions expressed are those of the speakers or artists only and do not necessarily reflect the views of the UC Regents, KZSE staff management, or underwriters. We welcome your feedback on our programming. Please direct your comments to the Program Review Committee at 831-459-4726 or by email at prc@kzse.org. And folks, if you want your voice to be heard on the show that's going on in City Council on Tuesday at 5:30, you can email citycouncil@cityofsantacruz.com, or you can call 831-420-5020. So yeah, there's a lot going on at the state. We're looking at tens of billions of dollars of budget shortfall.
You do that. let me finish that thought, and I apologize for making you have to read that statement, but it made the point, really.
No,
clearly.
it sounded apt, yes.
Okay, go on.
Yeah, and I don't need to take a position on local land use items, but I could not remain silent during this, given that history in risking just your legal position, your financial position, to lose it all because somebody changes the goalpost after you've invested, you've gone through the permitting process where the laws are as they are. I just couldn't keep quiet. So
yeah, and the point that you make in your op-ed is that when you look back at a time when very few stepped up and very few stood with you, that when you have WAMM, the Women's Alliance of Medical Marijuana, who did, and now they're playing by the rules, you do have to step up and stand with them in their time of need.
It's true, and instinctively, don't get me wrong. I was openly gay at the beginning of the 1980s in elected office when there were 8 to 10 in the entire United States. It's not like I run away from controversies, but instinctively, you like, oh man, do I have to get involved in this? But I think in this case, it has shifted the debate, and that was the important thing to do.
So, I promise this has a point. So there are 34 states that still criminalize HIV status. California is not one of them, but there still are a ton, more than half of the states that criminalize HIV status.
When you say criminalize HIV, what do you mean?
Like if you are HIV positive, people don't enforce it, but you can technically be arrested in those states for having HIV positive status.
Wow.
Even though there are medications that do make it so that you are no longer testing positive and can't pass it on to other people as well. But anyway, so there are also a ton of people in prisons in on probation, in the, that whole system that were arrested for marijuana charges. And there's still people in California prisons that were arrested for marijuana, and other states that have legal marijuana laws that are still in prison. Is there something that can be done in an effort, along with WAMM and all of these other organizations, to get rid of the HIV laws entirely nationally, and to decriminalize and expunge those people's records that have been in prison, that are still in prison for marijuana charges?
Well, there's a real distinction between California and the rest of the country, and the Attorney General has announced the whole plan to expunge and to remove, and I think there's an effort to deal with anybody that is in prison solely for that. It gets complicated because you might have a violent felony and that with it, and the violent felony is what really governs whether they stay in prison. And so, but nationally, normally my suggestion would be get a case to the Supreme Court, but this Supreme Court is living in another century, and that is not necessarily a good thing. And let me add one other thing, given the start of the conversation and the start of the question. We're talking about the law, but there is a stigma, and there are ways people punish people that aren't even within the law or within that. I mean, people stigmatize in a way. And since I'm wading into incredible controversies, let me tell you one story that makes the point. And that is the one time I was in Israel and I was an assembly member, they have a standard tour, and I asked to do a few things that weren't on the tour. And one of them was to go to a gay center, an LGBT center. So with another assembly member and we went and met with the executive director of the LGBT center in Jerusalem. And to my horror, I discovered that it's very difficult for anybody in the West Bank to be open about their HIV status. And so a lot of people there crossed the border and got their confidential care through the LGBT center in Jerusalem. And their families didn't know. This is the account of the executive director. Their families didn't know. They were not out as a person with HIV where they lived. And then there would be these fracases, and the border would close. And when the border closed, these people were cut off from their HIV care, and they were not getting it in the Palestine territory, and there were people that didn't know. And so it talks about sort of the stigma and what it is, and it's like that's just one case study in what happens around the world and around the United States. And so that's why it's so important to just speak out in a way that we're constantly moving the ball forward on the stigma. And we hope we get the laws. I'm sorry somebody didn't bring a case when the Supreme Court was the same Supreme Court that did marriage equality, because it would have probably ended up the right way. So that's the situation. It's not just legal, but it's sort of cultural.
If you're just tuning in, folks, we're talking to California State Senator John Laird about HIV status and about medical marijuana usage and about the budget. If you have any questions for Senator Laird, you can feel free to text us at 831-459-4036. We're a little bit late in the interview now, but we'll see if we can cram something in. And if you appreciate our programming and you appreciate the conversations that you hear on air on this station, we're doing our spring fundraiser right now, kzse.fm/give. Please point your browser over there. Throw us a few bucks. Any amount really goes a long way. Community radio cannot exist without your help. Thank you in advance.
So, John, Senator Laird, I want to pivot to a subject that you're going to be speaking about next week. Until the United States ratifies the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, the U.S. can claim out to 200 miles from the coast. But the state only goes 3 miles from mean high tide. So everything between 3 miles and 200 is the federal government. And the federal government has leased 5 California wind farms, offshore California wind farms, to 5 different companies that spent billions for this acreage. 3 of them are off Morro Bay, and 2 of them are up off Humboldt. The Biden administration wants the USA to have 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And you're speaking at the California Offshore Wind Conference next week in Sacramento. What are you going to be talking about, and how can the state help facilitate this transition to green energy?
Well, I'm going to be talking about sort of the current state of play, particularly in the leases off of Morro Bay. And this is so complicated by the fact that there are state waters, and you do need ports that are within local and state control to service and construct this. And there's this chicken and egg of what you just said, the companies investing billions years before they have it up and have a revenue stream. And down there's even this complicating factor, because a lot of us are advocating for a new marine sanctuary that begins south of the Monterey Bay Marine Sanctuary and is off the coast there. It would tentatively be called the Shumash National Marine thing, after a tribe that is in the area. And there was a crossover of they need the cables to bring the electricity in from the offshore wind. They bring it right through this sanctuary. And so there has been a tentative compromise between the tribes and some of the sanctuary advocates and the wind farm companies to allow for a passage of cables that is through this area, because the key thing is this needs to be designated before the end of Joe Biden's first term. And if it gets delayed too much longer, the entire sanctuary could blow up. So I think the advocates for the sanctuary recognized they needed to come to a deal here. And then there's considerable disquiet about the size of ports that might be in San Luis Obispo County. And basically, it's a much smaller port that's needed there just to service it once it's up. And the port of Los Angeles or Long Beach will probably be the place that they assemble or have the biggest staging area and bring things up. So you've got this, and the Diablo Canyon issue is a big one, because the idea is Diablo Canyon phases out, and the transmission of the electricity from Diablo Canyon, that transmission would then be used as the transmission for offshore wind, and it's in place, permitted and in place. And up in Humboldt, they don't have the transmission. They're struggling with trying to figure out how they're going to bring the energy onshore or to the south in a way that it can plug into the California grid. So it's all these things. It's because there's an additional layer of environmental protection concerns about marine mammals and birds, that to make sure they're not affected by this. How do you bring the power in? What are the ports like? How do you make sure you have the transmission? How do you do this in time so that this comes? Because we are trying to transition to renewable energy with very, very ambitious goals, and we're on the verge of being behind in them, even though we've done an amazing amount thus far. So I'm going to talk about all those issues and how it's coming to play. The other thing that ties into this loosely is battery storage. There's a controversial battery storage plant proposed for Morro Bay in the old power plant there where the stacks are and things. There's huge battery storage and expansion plans for Moss Landing. And if you look at it, because we don't, wind comes at a certain time, sun only comes during daylight hours, and the grid has to be stable. And so battery storage, we've been adding exponentially in California, and it stabilizes the grid. If it turns out that we're generating more renewable than the grid can take, then it goes into storage. And if we're generating less than the grid needs, then battery storage evens it out. It's plugged into the grid, and it automatically launches power into the grid. And at the time of the near outage a year ago, September, there was a period of time when we had more battery storage power coming onto the grid in California than we had from the nuclear power plant at Diablo. So it's all these things fitting together, and the state of play right now on some of them is what I will talk about at the Wind Energy Conference.
We have a listener who's texted us and asked about the crazy high rates that people pay. I don't know how you impact that as a senator, but also the overall transition from fossil fuels to clean energy.
Oh, big questions. On the rates, you do impact that as a senator. I had a bill 2 years ago to try to establish a climate trust to be able to put money into it, to be able to kind of lower the rates and buy out some of our climate programs that are embedded in the rates, because those should be coming from the state budget. They all should not be coming from ratepayers. And it is the ratepayers at the lower income and middle income levels that are getting socked harder by all this than anything else. And the State Public Utilities Commission, which the governor appoints, actually regulates the rates. But there's a lot of debate about how to impact them from the legislative level. And then we are trying everything to move on the conversion from fossil fuels to renewables, because obviously, and there have been times on the grid in just the last few weeks where 100% of the power has been from renewable sources. So we are getting there, but it's as I was just alluding to, it's not all the time. You have to have things that balance out the grid. And we have to figure out there will be some proposals to streamline some of the regulating for renewable projects because it's taking too long compared to when the power is needed. And so there's going to be some animated debates on the next steps of the conversion from fossil fuels to renewables that will be front and center in the next year or two.
Well, given the fact that, the late night hosts and the conservative media make jokes about regulation in California and red tape and whatnot, I believe it will be deliciously ironic if the California Assembly and the California Senate and the governor can streamline regulation, like you just said, to get offshore wind at scale online in California, while New Jersey is still arguing about how much they're going to pay and whether it's going to happen at all. So anything that the state can do to help facilitate this transition on the state side, because everything from 3 miles in, plus the batteries, plus the transmission is all on the state. I think it would be.
Well, Dan, we have a couple minutes left. You mentioned New Jersey. My favorite comparison is Texas, because Texas decided they don't want to link. We're linked to the entire West. So if there's wind going in Wyoming and it doldrums in California, we can still have renewable energy. Except for a little bit of the Panhandle and El Paso, Texas does not connect outside of Texas. And they thought they were smarter than the universe, so they didn't even insulate the windmills and wind turbines. So when they had that storm a few years ago and Ted Cruz was in Cancun rather than Texas, the wind turbines were working perfectly in Iowa in sub-zero weather, and they froze, and natural gas pipes froze in Texas, and they just had a massive meltdown of their energy grid. And so you can make the comparison. We're insulated. We're relying on other states. We're not stupid. And so that is what's happening in comparison to some of the other states.
Well, Senator Laird, we appreciate the conversation here at KZSC Santa Cruz. I'm Dangerous Dan.
I'm Kalamity Kyle.
I'm Kaos.
And we're encouraging you all to point your browsers to kzse.fm/give and support radio and public affairs and, live people having live conversations with listeners chiming in to support this kind of radio. kzse.fm/give.
I just want to highlight somebody about 15, 20 minutes ago, it looks like, an anonymous donor donated $200.
Wow.
Nice.
So
Thank
shout
you
out
so much.
to that anonymous donor. Thank you so much. Of course, if you're out there and thinking about donating, you do not need to donate as much. You can donate more. You can donate less. Any amount helps. Thank you.
Senator Laird, we're going to be talking to you next month. Deep dives
I'll
into
look
local,
forward to it.
state, and renewables.
Okay, I'll be ready. Have a good day.
Thanks.
You
Take
too,
care, Senator Laird.
Okay, be well. You've been listening to a podcast from an interview on the Bushwhackers Breakfast Club on KZSC 88.1 FM in Santa Cruz, California. This interview has been produced by myself, Dangerous Dan Orange. KZSC is a student-run college and community non-commercial educational radio station broadcasting from the UC Santa Cruz campus. You can stream KZSC online at kzsc.org. Thanks for listening.